She slapped a black billionaire, and just 2 minutes later her entire world flipped upside down. In this jaw-dropping story, a flight attendant makes the mistake of a lifetime by disrespecting a man she had no idea held immense power and wealth. What follows is a ruthless, calculated revenge that leaves everyone on the flight stunned. This cinematic tale of karma, power, and justice will have you glued to your screen. Watch until the end to witness how one man's quiet strength turns into a storm of consequences. If you love real-life drama, shocking twists, and powerful comebacks, this video is a must-watch. Not that any of that was apparent to Bethany Marshall as she moved efficiently through the first-class cabin, distributing pre-departure beverages with practiced precision. When she reached Sebastian's seat, her customer service smile flickered almost imperceptibly, a momentary glitch in her professional demeanor. "Excuse me," she began, her voice carrying that particular blend of sweetness and authority that flight attendants perfect. "I think there may be some confusion with your seat assignment. This is the first-class cabin." Sebastian looked up from his Wall Street Journal, meeting Bethany's gaze with the same patient dignity he'd maintained through 66 years of similar interactions. "Yes, I'm aware," he replied evenly, extending his boarding pass. "Seat 2A." Bethany examined the boarding pass with a scrutiny she hadn't applied to any previous passenger, all of whom happened to be white. Her French-tipped nails tapped against the paper as she searched for some discrepancy, some error, that would explain what her unconscious bias had already decided: that this elderly black man in his worn but well-maintained suit couldn't possibly belong in first class. "This does say 2A," she acknowledged reluctantly, "but I'm showing this seat should be occupied by a Mr. Dixon. There must be a mix-up at the gate." "I am Sebastian Dixon," he confirmed, his Georgia accent softened but still present after decades in California. "And I can assure you, there's no mix-up." Something in his calm certainty gave Bethany pause. Her eyes flicked to his hands, noting the understated gold signet ring and the edge of the Patek Philippe beneath his cuff, then back to his face, reassessing. "I see," she said, recalibrating her approach with visible effort. "My apologies, Mr. Dixon. May I offer you champagne or perhaps water before takeoff?" "Water would be fine, thank you," Sebastian replied, accepting her apology with the same grace he displayed throughout the exchange. Not because it was deserved, but because 60-plus years of similar interactions had taught him to be strategic about which battles deserved his energy. As Bethany moved on to the next passenger, a young white tech executive who received her full, unquestioning professional warmth, Sebastian returned to his newspaper while mentally filing away the interaction. Not because it was unusual, but precisely because it wasn't. What Bethany couldn't know, what no one on the flight was yet aware of, was that in 48 hours, Sebastian Dixon would be announced as the majority shareholder and incoming chairman of Jetstream Airways, following months of quiet acquisition of the struggling carrier's stock. The airline industry was the final frontier in his decades-long mission to transform America's logistics infrastructure, and Jetstream's innovative route structure but troubled corporate culture made it the perfect target for both financial investment and social impact. Sebastian's strategy had always been the same: buy controlling interest in companies operating in calcified industries, implement sweeping modernization paired with genuine cultural reform, and transform troubled assets into both profitable enterprises and vehicles for systemic change. He had done it with trucking companies in the 1980s, shipping firms in the 1990s, and warehousing technology in the 2000s. Now, as he contemplated his legacy in his 9th decade, commercial aviation represented his final challenge. As the remaining first-class passengers boarded, Sebastian observed Bethany's interactions with a professional eye. Her service wasn't uniformly poor. In fact, she displayed impressive efficiency and attention to detail. But there was an unmistakable pattern to how that service was distributed. The middle-aged white couple in 1A and 1B received warmth, casual conversation, and proactive attention to their needs. The young South Asian man in 3C was served correctly but coolly, with minimal engagement beyond functional necessity. These weren't dramatic differences, no ignored call buttons or explicitly rude comments, but rather the subtle calibration of warmth, respect, and presumed belonging that Sebastian had observed throughout his business career. The invisible tax placed on passengers of color wasn't in the technical aspects of service, but in being subtly reminded that their presence in premium spaces was surprising, requiring additional verification, warranting less personal engagement. "More water, Mr. Dixon?" Bethany asked as the boarding process completed, her tone now professionally courteous, if not particularly warm. "Yes, thank you, Bethany," Sebastian replied, deliberately using her name, a small reminder of the human connection that service interactions were meant to establish. She refilled his glass efficiently but moved on without the brief moment of casual conversation she'd included when refilling the drinks of white passengers. It wasn't malice. Sebastian knew that. It was something more insidious because it was largely unconscious. The automated calibration of engagement based on deeply ingrained assumptions about who belonged in which spaces and what level of service they deserved. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and meal service began, Sebastian continued his careful observation of the cabin dynamics. The pattern persisted. White passengers were addressed by name, engaged with brief personal remarks, and tended to with subtle anticipation of their needs. Passengers of color received technically proficient but emotionally distant service. Their requests fulfilled but rarely anticipated. Their comfort ensured but their presence never quite normalized. Midway through the flight, a situation unfolded that crystallized what Sebastian had been observing. The South Asian passenger in 3C pressed his call button, waiting patiently for assistance. 2 minutes passed. 3. Bethany moved through the cabin, responding to a white passenger's request in 4B, while the illuminated button above 3C remained conspicuously unanswered. After 5 minutes, the passenger pressed the button again. When Bethany finally approached, nearly 7 minutes after the initial request, her expression carried a hint of irritation rather than concern for the delay. "Yes?" she asked, her tone suggesting interruption rather than service. "I asked for a blanket some time ago," the passenger explained politely. "It's quite cold in this section. I'll check if we have any left," Bethany replied, her tone implying scarcity rather than certainty. "We may be out." Yet 3 minutes later, Sebastian observed her offering blankets to both white passengers in row 1, neither of whom had requested them, with a solicitous, "I noticed it's a bit chilly. Would either of you like a blanket?" It was this moment, not the earlier interaction with Sebastian himself, that cemented his first major decision as Jetstream's incoming chairman. The issue wasn't just individual bias, but systemic patterns that had clearly become normalized within the airline's culture. Patterns that affected not just passenger experience, but likely employee advancement, vendor selection, and countless other aspects of the company's operations. When the flight landed in San Francisco, Sebastian remained in his seat as other passengers gathered their belongings and deplaned. He had a car waiting, but more importantly, he had a call scheduled with Martin Reynolds, Jetstream's current CEO, who was unaware that the potential investor he'd been courting was now positioned to become his boss. As the cabin emptied, Bethany approached Sebastian's seat with the professional smile she reserved for end-of-flight pleasantries with premium passengers. "Thank you for flying with Jetstream today, Mr. Dixon. I hope you enjoyed your flight." "The flight was illuminating," Sebastian replied thoughtfully. "Tell me, Bethany, how long have you been with Jetstream?" Surprise flickered across her face at the personal question. 12 years next month. I started as a regional flight attendant and worked my way up to international first class." "Impressive dedication," Sebastian acknowledged. "And do you enjoy your work?" "I do," she answered, her tone suggesting both pride and slight confusion at the conversation's direction. "The travel can be exhausting, but I've always loved aviation." Sebastian nodded, making a mental note. "One more question, if you don't mind. Does Jetstream provide any training on unconscious bias or equity in customer service? The question landed like an unexpected patch of turbulence. Bethany's professional composure wavered as she processed its implications. We have diversity modules in our annual training, she managed, her discomfort evident. Standard material. I see, Sebastian said simply. Thank you for your candor. I suspect we'll be seeing each other again. 3 days later, Bethany Marshall was summoned to Jetstream's corporate headquarters in Atlanta for what she assumed would be a disciplinary meeting. The email had been vague but ominous. Required attendance regarding a passenger service incident on Flight 1457, April 15th. Her stomach knotted as she sat in the sterile waiting area outside the executive conference room. In 12 years of flying, she'd never been called to headquarters. Whatever had prompted this couldn't be good for her career. When the door finally opened, Bethany was surprised to find not the regional service manager she'd expected, but Martin Reynolds, Jetstream's CEO, looking uncharacteristically subdued. "Ms. Marshall, please come in," he said, gesturing toward the conference room where 3 people were already seated. Patricia Okonkwo, Jetstream's general counsel, James Chen, VP of Human Resources, and, to Bethany's shock, the elderly black passenger from Flight 1457, Sebastian Dixon, now dressed in a custom suit that even Bethany's untrained eye could recognize cost more than her monthly salary. "Thank you for coming in today," Martin began once everyone was seated. "Before we proceed, I'd like to introduce Sebastian Dixon, who will be announced tomorrow as Jetstream's new majority shareholder and incoming chairman." The revelation landed with seismic force. Bethany's mind raced back through every interaction with the passenger she'd initially tried to remove from first class, recontextualizing each moment with the devastating realization that she had attempted to displace her company's future owner. "Mr. Dixon has raised concerns about service consistency in our premium cabins," Martin continued, his careful phrasing not quite disguising the severity of the situation, specifically regarding how that service may vary based on passenger demographics. Bethany felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications became clear. This wasn't about a single misstep. It was about patterns of behavior she had never been forced to examine. Patterns now observed firsthand by someone with the power to determine Jetstream's entire future direction. "Ms. Marshall," Sebastian Dixon said, speaking for the first time, his voice carrying the same calm dignity it had on the flight, "I want to be clear that this meeting isn't designed to single you out for punishment. What I observed on Flight 1457 wasn't unique to you or even to Jetstream. It reflects industry-wide patterns that have become normalized to the point of invisibility, at least to those not on the receiving end." He paused, allowing his words to register before continuing. "However, normalization doesn't equal acceptability. What I witnessed wasn't merely poor customer service, but a consistent pattern of differentiated treatment based on perceived belonging." The assessment was delivered without anger, but with a clarity that made denial impossible. Bethany found herself unable to formulate the defensive response that had instinctively risen to her lips. There was something about Sebastian Dixon's measured evaluation that demanded honest reflection rather than reflexive justification. I'm not sure what to say," she admitted finally. "I've never thought of myself as treating passengers differently. Few of us consciously recognize our own biases," Sebastian acknowledged. "That's what makes them particularly resistant to change. But I'd like you to reflect on a few specific interactions from that flight." What followed was a detailed, time-stamped account of service disparities that Bethany had never consciously registered. Response times to call buttons that varied by passenger race. Proactive offers made to some passengers, while others had to explicitly request the same services. Variations in personal engagement from cursory to warmly conversational based on nothing but demographic factors. Laid out in this systematic way, the pattern was undeniable. Bethany felt a complex wave of emotions, defensive indignation giving way to genuine shock as she recognized behaviors she had never examined, despite enacting them hundreds of times. "This isn't about your individual character, Ms. Marshall," Sebastian continued, his tone remaining measured. "It's about systems that shape behavior without conscious awareness. The question now is what Jetstream intends to do about these systems moving forward." Martin Reynolds straightened, clearly prepared for this opening. "We're implementing a comprehensive review of our service protocols, retraining all customer-facing staff, and establishing new metrics for consistent service quality across all passenger demographics." The response was prompt but generic, corporate damage control rather than genuine transformation. Sebastian's slight smile suggested he recognized it as such. "All necessary steps," he acknowledged, "but addressing systemic issues requires more than procedural adjustments. It requires cultural transformation, led by people who understand the problem from multiple perspectives." He turned his attention back to Bethany, who had remained silent during this exchange. "Ms. Marshall, you have 12 years of experience with this airline. You clearly care about aviation and take pride in your work. You also now have something equally valuable: a newfound awareness of patterns you previously couldn't see." Bethany looked up, confused by the shift in tone from evaluation to something approaching opportunity. The proposal was so unexpected that Bethany initially thought she'd misheard. "You want me to help lead a diversity initiative? After what happened?" "Precisely because of what happened," Sebastian confirmed. "Transformation doesn't come from punishing individuals for systemic problems. It comes from converting awareness into action. You now have awareness that most of your colleagues still lack. The question is whether you're willing to use that awareness to create change." The offer hung in the air between them. Not absolution or dismissal of what had occurred, but a challenging path towards something constructive. Bethany found herself weighing not just the professional opportunity, but the moral invitation to engage with biases she had never before been asked to examine. "I would need guidance," she said finally. "I clearly have blind spots I didn't recognize." "We all do," Sebastian replied simply. "The difference is in how we respond when those blind spots are illuminated. Some become defensive, retreating further into justification. Others see opportunity for growth. I'm betting you're in the latter category, Ms. Marshall." The view from 38,000 feet offered perspective, not just on the landscape below, but on the journey still ahead. A journey that would continue long after Sebastian Dixon's final flight, carried forward by transformed systems and, perhaps more importantly, by individuals like Bethany Marshall, who had converted uncomfortable awareness into committed action.